Welcome to Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. In this series we look at crimes that brought the criminal into court to face the ultimate sentence. We look at killers that made the final slow walk to the gallows, and also those whose lives were spared and granted a reprieve. All cases covered in the series are based on decades of research for the Hangman's Record, my 3-volume series of books covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles can be obtained through my website stevefielding.com. If you enjoyed these videos, please subscribe and press like to help us reach a wider audience and enable the channel to continue to grow. As always, use the comments below for thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for future episodes in this series are always welcomed. It is the autumn of 1941. Britain has been at war for more than 2 years, and there is now a lull in the bombing of the major towns and cities as Hitler's Nazi Germany concentrates its efforts on the Soviet Union. But air raid sirens still pierce the night as enemy aircraft make their sporadic sorties. King George VI is on the throne, and 32nd US President Franklin D. Roosevelt is in the White House. Winston Churchill is 1 year into his role as Prime Minister, leading a nation surviving on determination and the belief that it will win through. But with America yet to enter the war, people are exhausted, anxious and on edge. There is strict rationing for food and clothing, and with a shortage of fresh produce, many have adopted the request to dig for victory. Everyone is expected to do their bit in helping with the war effort, with tasks like collecting newspapers and scrap metal fostering strong community spirit, alongside the hardships and losses. With conscription extended to help with those fighting overseas, women are now engaged in jobs previously done by men, like working in engineering and driving buses. Those serving on the home front work long hours in factories, docks and offices by day, and sleep in shelters by night. Fire watching becomes mandatory on business premises, and that summer the National Fire Service is established. But even in wartime, life goes on. Cinemas are packed, and variety theatres like the Windmill in London boast the sign, "We never close." Audiences flock to see stars like George Formby, Gracie Fields and Margaret Lockwood, with films such as The 49th Parallel, The Lady Vanishes and Pimpernel Smith amongst the most popular. Government propaganda films offer help with morale and remind the public of what they're fighting for. On the wireless, songs by Vera Lynn, Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters are amongst the most popular, while band leader Glenn Miller, Geraldo and Joe Loss pack the dance halls. In April 1941, singer Al Bowley is killed when a bomb explodes outside his London apartment. But beneath the surface of this familiar wartime Britain lies something darker. Fear does not only come from the enemy bombers overhead, but from crimes committed in the shadows, crimes that would lead the killer to stand before the court and ultimately face the hangman. This is Tales from the Hangman's Record, and today's story takes us back to London in the autumn of 1941. The German air raids on many British cities in the early days of the Second World War had resulted in strictly enforced nighttime measures. Blackout conditions in London were imposed in September 1939, the aim being that by maintaining as much darkness as possible, it would make enemy bombing of strategic targets harder to hit. Blackout curtains were mandatory in every household, and even showing just a chink of light would see the ARP warden shout, "Put that light out," and the risk of a hefty fine. For the criminal, it afforded a natural cover against praying eyes from both the nosy neighbour and the overworked police officer. It was during the blackout in London in the autumn of 1941 that Scotland Yard were faced with an unprecedented series of murders, stretching their resources almost to breaking point and causing them to set up what the press deemed a brains trust of top murder squad detectives, along with pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Superintendent George Salter and his staff at the Metropolitan Police Science Laboratory. The first incident had come to light on Friday morning the 10th of October, when a park keeper employed by Hendon Borough Council was found shot dead in a hut at Mount Park, Edgware in North London. The body of 54-year-old John Child was discovered by Horace Drool, an elderly man who lived 400 yards away and was a frequent visitor to the park. Drool told police that he would often stop by to chat with him and had gone to the park to give Child, who was known locally as Jovial Jack, some of his own-grown vegetables. Drool said that he had arrived at the hut at around 10:15 to find the door wide open. He entered and found Child lying on the floor in the far right-hand corner with his back propped up against a cupboard. He had been shot 4 times. A 5th bullet had missed and was later found embedded in the hut wall. As detectives under the command of Superintendent George Yansel and Chief Inspector Arthur Thorpe arrived at the scene and began their investigation, they found there was no disorder in the hut other than some broken crockery, as though someone had dropped a cup and saucer while washing up. The man's face and hands were covered with blood, and following a post-mortem, pathologist Spilsby formed the opinion the man had been shot sometime between 3 and 3:30 on the previous afternoon. This was supported when the man's watch, still attached to his wrist, was found to have stopped at 3:17 p.m. Dr. Spilsby also told the detectives the wounds could not have been self-inflicted. John Child had lodged with Albert and Emily Keane at 45 Birkbeck Road in the Mill Hill district for over 12 years, and he had worked at the park since July 1930. He had separated from his wife Nora in 1919 after over 20 years of marriage due to his drinking, and when detectives spoke to her, she told them she had neither seen or spoke to her husband from the time she had packed her bags and left. Nora Child also said her husband had not contributed any money to the upkeep of their 2 children. They traced the daughter, now married and living in New Haven, and learned she had been in hospital at the time of the murder. They also found that their son was stationed in Northern Ireland, serving as a private in the Royal Army Service Corps. Detectives then heard from another park keeper who had known the murdered man when they had worked together, and he told them that John Child was poorly educated and given to petty pilfering of things like tools and lamps from bicycles left near his hut, as well as cigarettes from a local tobacconist. Robbery had been quickly ruled out, as beside the man's watch not being taken, detectives found 7 £1 notes, 30 shillings in silver, and a number of copper coins in his clothing, and Chief Inspector Thorpe even told reporters that they were not ruling out the possibility that this was just a motiveless murder. Inquiries then revealed that Child frequently acted as a peeping Tom, spying on courting couples who visited the park. Had he been caught by someone and killed as a result? It did seem quite a brutal crime and talked out of proportion as a punishment for such an act, but for the time being, detectives were keeping their options open. When they examined John Child's movements on the day of the murder, they learned that he had supposed to have started work at 7 o'clock, but had been seen by 2 men fishing at the pond, arriving at about 20 to 9. Landlord Bert Keane said he was unsure what time he had left that morning, but his wife said Child had gone to bed on Wednesday night suffering from a cold and might have left the house later than usual. Detectives then learned of Child's association with a number of married women, and one in particular, 42-year-old Mrs. Violet Staines, who worked in a nearby cafe that the dead man frequented. She said she had been with Child in his hut from about 10:45 until around 1:30, except for a few minutes around 11 o'clock when Child had gone off on his bike to one of the nearby shops. She also told them that Child would often take a nap in his hut after lunch for about an hour. A witness told police he had seen Child leave the park on his bike at around 11:10, but police were unable to trace anyone who had seen him after he'd last been seen by Mrs. Staines at 1:30. With Spilsby putting the time of death at around 3 o'clock, there was an hour-and-a-half gap which detectives were unable to account for. Mrs. Staines had first met John Child about 9 or 10 years ago in a local pub, whilst in the company of her husband. She said that although she had seen him in the park and at various other places subsequently, it was not until around August that they had become particularly friendly. In the 4 weeks before his murder, she had met Child in the park almost every day, except for Saturdays. She had told the park keeper of the trouble that she was having with her husband, and in the previous month, while in the company of her married daughter, Child had asked her to go with him to the Golders Green Hippodrome on the following evening. She agreed, and they met outside the theatre. After the show, he took her part of the way home and kissed her goodnight. She said that her husband had arrived home a few minutes earlier, and she told him where she had been, but not who with. She also met John Child on Sunday afternoon the 21st of September at Golders Green bus terminus, and they travelled to Kew Gardens. When they arrived back at Golders Green, she said that Child, who she called Jack, made love to her that night. They met again in the days leading up to his death as she continued to visit him at his hut, but said that there was no further intimacy between them. Violet had last seen him on Thursday the 9th of October when she left the hut at around 1:15. Child had walked her to the park gates, and as it had been raining heavily, he loaned her an old Macintosh which was still in her possession. Detectives were able to ascertain that the only people that knew that Violet Staines and John Child had begun out together were her daughter and the daughter's mother-in-law. Neither of them had told her husband about it, and there's no evidence that he knew anything of the association. As a result, he was quickly ruled out of the police inquiries. Chief Inspector Thorpe also learned of an altercation between John Child and landlord Albert Keane when he had accused the tenant of being too familiar with his wife. They had come to blows in the kitchen over the allegations, which both Child and Emily Keane denied, and although detectives believed that there had been some kind of relationship between Child and his landlady, her husband had an alibi for the afternoon of the murder, and he was also ruled out as a suspect. 2 other women who Child was known to have associated with were also questioned, and investigations into their husbands found that they both had alibis for the time of the murder. Newspapers then reported that a jealous husband, a soldier home on leave, had accused Child of inappropriate liaisons with his wife and taken her with him to confront the park keeper. Though detectives learned that a man and woman had been seen walking towards the hut at around 3 o'clock, and despite scores of detectives working around the clock on the case, their identity was never discovered, and gradually all leads petered out. Over 2,000 guns were examined and eliminated from police inquiries, and the murder weapon was never traced. An inquest held later that year found that John Child had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. As Scotland Yard detectives hunted the killer of the park keeper, they were then called upon to investigate another murder just a few days later. On Monday morning, the 13th of October, demolition worker Charles Smith led a team of workmates up the debris-covered broken steps of 225 Hampstead Road, 500 yards from Euston Station in the Mornington Crescent district of Camden Town in North London. What had once been a solid residence, number 225 was now just a shell, and was the last in a row of several badly bombed buildings in the process of demolition. As Smith made his way through the hall to the back of the house, something caught his eye lying in the thick plaster dust that covered the floorboards. Taking a closer look, he saw it was the body of a young woman, wearing a short black coat open at the top, with a white slip lay across her thighs. Her otherwise naked body rested precariously on the few remaining floorboards in the front ground floor room of the house, the only structural portion of that building still standing. Smith wasted no time in summoning the police. Chief Superintendent George Yandel, called away from the investigation into the murder of John Child, along with Detective Chief Inspector William Parker, headed the investigation, joined at the scene by pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Sunday had been a freezing night, and the body was now stiff and disfigured. It was clear she had been strangled, with her cami knickers used as a ligature, and from the cuts and bruises found upon her, there was little doubt there must have been a fierce struggle. The thick coating of dust on the soles of her feet indicated that she had taken off her shoes before she had met her death. The rest of her clothes, together with her gas mask and handbag, had been flung or had fallen through the shattered floor into the basement below. Her handbag had been rifled and any money she may have had was missing. An identity card gave her name as Maple Church, a pretty 19-year-old clerk with the Hackney Borough Council Electricity Department, with a home on Carlton Road in Tufnell Park. Before the body was removed from the scene, Yandle calls for the services of fingerprint expert Superintendent Fred Cherrell. Cherrell carefully examined the body of the dead girl and was able to obtain a print from where a finger had been pressed hard into the flesh. He determined it must have been made within a short time after death, as if it had been made while she was alive, the flesh would have recovered its normal level, there would be no sign of the impression. Police investigations soon led them to hear from a neighbour, George Fleming, who said he had heard a scream at about 9:45 that Sunday night. He went to his front door, but hearing nothing more, assumed it was just a drunken woman. Then, at 11 o'clock, he went to the door again to see whether the lights beside the railway bridge were out, which would have told him that there was an air raid imminent. He then saw a man with a lighted cigarette in his hand walking away from close to where the murder had taken place. Unfortunately, the man was too far away for him to give much of a description. The timing, though, was supported by a woman living nearby who had also heard a woman scream at about 9:50, and a soldier going home along Hampstead Road said he had heard a very loud and unpleasant scream around 10 o'clock. Workmates believed Maple Church, who had changed her name from Churchyard, was a happy and respectable, fun-loving girl, and friend Vera Wyman, who had been staying with Maple for the weekend, helped detectives build a picture of her movements on the previous day. She said that on Sunday evening they had been in the West End and made their way together to Charing Cross Station, where just before 9 o'clock Maple had waved her off onto a train to West Wickham, telling Vera she was going straight home to write a letter to her boyfriend, a merchant Navy gunner named Don, who was away at sea. Yandle and his men pondered how the dead girl ended up in the derelict ruin. To get home from Charing Cross, she would take the Northern Line from the adjacent Strand tube station to Tufnell Park. It was then a 5-minute walk to Carlton Road. It seemed likely she had caught the 9:07 train from the Strand to Tufnell Park, so how did she come to be in the Mornington Crescent area 3 stops earlier than her destination? Had the killer picked her up as she was making her way home? Detectives also wondered if instead of the tube, she had taken either the 24 or 29 bus from just across the Strand, both of which travelled north towards Camden Town. She was almost certainly killed between 9:45 and 10 o'clock, about an hour after leaving her friend at Charing Cross. But who had she met on this journey home, and how had she been persuaded to accompany him to the spot where the body was found? London that autumn was full of deserters, many living precariously in the bombed houses, and it was possible that the murderer was one of these men who had picked up Mabel and taken her to a public house for a drink before heading to the bomb building. The post-mortem carried out by Sir Bernard Spilsbury showed that despite the body having been partially naked, she had not been sexually assaulted. Although her friend Vera said they hadn't been for a drink that day, there was alcohol in her system, which suggested she may have been drinking with the killer, who Spilsbury believed may have been left-handed. He concluded that death had occurred around 10 o'clock, which tied in with the various statements from witnesses who had heard screams on the previous evening. On the following day, Superintendent Yandle was called for another investigation, and Chief Inspector Parker took charge of the inquiries. With a number of messages soon reaching him from people who knew the dead girl, a very different picture of her lifestyle began to emerge. Although her workmates thought her quiet and respectable, and her friend Vera had said she had a boyfriend serving at sea, detectives now learned that on many occasions Maple Church allowed herself to be picked up by servicemen, and contraceptives found in her handbag at the murder scene were proof enough she was prepared for a chance encounter on the Sunday evening when she died. There was even suggestion Maple was working as a prostitute and would have thus consented to lovemaking in the building, and that the killer therefore had been a maniac who had taken pleasure in taking her young life. Parker also learned that in the previous year, Maple Church had been the mistress of a married man. He said his wife was in a sanatorium at the time, and on his free evenings he began to take Maple out for drives in the car. One evening they stopped in a secluded spot in Epping Forest, and climbed into the back of the car. Despite it being a frosty night, she had shocked him by suddenly removing all her clothes. She seemed to have a liking for older men, he told the detective, and said he was glad when his wife returned home and made it impossible for the association to continue. The man had an alibi for the night that Maple was murdered and was greatly relieved when told he would not be needed at the inquest. In all, Chief Inspector Parker took over 200 statements, but in spite of prodigious efforts on the part of detectives engaged in the case, the killer of Maple Church evaded capture. Work on demolishing the house had stopped while the murder inquiry was underway, but it was finally demolished on the 13th of July 1942, by which time the Scotland Yard detectives had been tasked with investigating more murders in the Blackout. With the investigations into the murders of John Child and Maple Church well underway, Scotland Yard were called to investigate the murder of a 65-year-old widow whose body was discovered in her apartment in Kensington, West London. Anxious to move out of the bombed and blacked out city, Mrs. Theodora Jessie Greenhill decided to let her furnished flat and advertised it through a local estate agent. Twice married, she'd been widowed in 1926 when her husband, Hubert Greenhill, a former major in the Dorset Regiment and a county cricketer who had twice represented England, had shot himself when he became depressed over financial matters. She now lived with one of her daughters, Sylvia, at 71A Elsham Road. On Tuesday morning, the 14th of October, Sylvia had left for work as normal at the Passport Control Office, leaving her mother alone in the flat. Sylvia knew her mother had met a prospective tenant on the previous day and was expecting to meet him again at lunchtime to confirm the tenancy. Twice during the day she telephoned to check on progress but could get no reply. Also trying to speak to her mother that day was another daughter, this time from her first marriage, Catherine Tattersall. She had returned to London, had been abroad since the end of June, and arriving at Euston Station, had telephoned but received no answer. She hailed a taxi and, reaching the flat, rang the bell but received no reply. Catherine knew that a key was secreted on a nail behind the main entrance door and managed to gain entry. Going into the drawing room, she was shocked to find the body of her mother lying on the floor in front of the bureau, a handkerchief of white silk with blue spots covering her face. Her screams alerted the taxi driver, unloading the luggage from his cab outside. He rushed into the house and, after checking for a pulse, confirmed she was dead and hurried to fetch the police. Chief Superintendent Bill Salisbury was tasked with leading the investigation and was joined at the scene by fingerprint expert Superintendent Fred Cherrell. Had the killer of Maple Church struck again? They soon dismissed the idea the two were connected. Although both victims were female, there was little else in common with the crimes. One was still in her teens, the other a widow in her mid-60s, and the locations could hardly be more different. Maple Church had met her end amongst the rubble and dust of a bombed-out building, while Mrs. Greenhill had drawn her last breaths on a plush carpet in an upmarket apartment in a desirable part of the metropolis. Also, this was clearly not a sexually motivated crime, the only thing linking the two being the cause of death and that both victims had been robbed. Pathologist Bernard Spilsby carried out the post-mortem and found that, like Maple Church, cause of death was by strangulation. From the position of her body, it seemed she had been sat at her bureau and then struck from behind with a milk bottle before the attacker had tied a ligature around her neck. The bureau had been ransacked, while the dressing table and wardrobe were in a similar state of disarray. As Salisbury went to work in the bedroom, Cherrell examined the various fingerprints that had been found on fragments of glass on a small table near the body and on a cash box that had been forced open with a nail file. He looked at the contents of the bureau and saw the dead woman had been in the process of writing out a receipt for a sum of money, presumably having agreed to rent out the apartment. It read, "Received from Dr. H.D. Trevor the sum of S." The pen then made a jagged line down the notepaper, seemingly when the killer had smashed the bottle onto her head with such force that it shattered, with pieces falling onto the floor and into a waste paper basket. Mrs. Greenhill had then collapsed unconscious onto the carpet, where the killer had gotten onto his knees and strangled her with a ligature. Dr. H.D. Trevor. Something about that name seemed familiar to the long-serving detective, but surely it must be false. No one would be so stupid as to leave his own name on the woman's desk. Nevertheless, Cheryl contacted the Criminal Record Office of Scotland Yard and asked for all files in the name of Trevor to be brought to him immediately. A police car quickly arrived with them, and with the aid of a magnifying glass, Cheryl compared those in the file with the suspect prints found in the flat. Within minutes, he was able to tell the astonished Chief Inspector Salisbury the name of the likely killer. Harold Dorian Trevor was a 61-year-old Yorkshire-born career criminal, well known to Scotland Yard, having spent most of the last 40 years in jail, and had in fact served so long behind bars he had spent just 11 months at liberty in all that time. Born on the 10th of January 1880, Trevor was 15-year-old when he stole a gentleman's cane and single eyeglass and launched a career that brought him notoriety as the man with the monocle. For the next 45 years, although his occupation was given as an architect, his aim was to avoid work and live in as much comfort and style as possible. Adopting such aliases as Rudolph Marjoribanks, Captain Strong, Commander Crichton, Sir Charles Warren and Lord Reginald Herbert, Trevor would set about swindling money from any source, usually female. His modus operandi varied little. Using one of his many aliases, Trevor would contact an estate agent for a list of properties for rent. Then, posing as the perfect gentleman tenant, and often with romantic intentions, especially if the landlady was a spinster or widowed, he would ingratiate himself before proceeding to steal whatever he could lay his hands on. The outcome, though, was predictably the same: a swift arrest followed by a court appearance and another term of imprisonment. In 1914, Trevor had escaped from police custody by jumping out of a moving train as it approached Fenchurch Street Station, knocking unconscious the policeman who had been on the platform. He was quickly recaptured and sentenced to another spell behind bars. Records show that having served 5 years for another theft and fraud, Trevor had been released from Parker's jail on Friday the 3rd of October 1941, less than a fortnight before the murder. On his release, one of the warders had warned him that, as he grew older and his charm diminished, he would find it harder to smooth-talk his victims and he would more likely resort to violence. Trevor dismissed this with a shake of the head. Up to now, apart from a spell in Maidstone jail when he was one of the ringleaders in a prison riot that needed the army to be called in to break it up, he had never been involved in any crimes that resulted in or needed any form of violence. However, the warder's prophecy had now come true, and an arrest warrant for Harold Dorian Trevor was issued, and the hunt for the thief-turned-murderer launched. Just 7 days after the body of John Child had been discovered, and with Scotland Yard senior detectives leading teams investigating the deaths of Maple Church and Theodora Greenhill, there was another murder in the north of the city, just a mile from the bombed-out building where Miss Church had been killed. Shortly before 7 o'clock on Friday morning, the 17th of October, Jill Steele was awoken by the barking of a little black terrier dog. 48-year-old widow Edith Eleanora Humphreys, her landlady in the large semi-detached house at 1 Gloucester Crescent, just a few streets northeast of Regent Park, had been dog-sitting for a tenant in the top-floor flat, but the barking from the normally quiet dog was unusual and growing louder. Jill, a heavy sleeper, lived on the first floor, and since being asked to mind the dog, she knew that around this time each morning, Mrs. Humphreys usually let it out into the back garden. She dressed and by 8 o'clock was ready for work, and as she prepared to leave, she went to see why the dog was still barking. As she made for the door, she noticed she could not find her front door key. She had it on the previous night when she'd come home and remembered that on entering, she had readjusted the blackout and, to leave her hands free, had put down her handbag, gloves and key on the kitchen table before going upstairs to her own room. Descending the stairs and entering the kitchen, she found no sign of the door key. She then called out softly to her landlady, who would normally be up by this time. Getting no reply, she approached the bedroom and could see that the door was wide open, but was pitch black inside, with the blackout blind still being in place. There was no reply when she called out again, and trying the bedroom light, she found the meter must have run out. She reached into her handbag for a little torch that most people carried to negotiate the darkest streets at night, and shining its beam inside, recoiled in horror at what she saw. Dressed in her nightclothes, Edith Humphreys lay sprawled across the bed, having been bludgeoned about the face and head, with her jaw broken in several places. The attacker had then attempted to strangle her before cutting her throat. There was also a single stab wound to the skull which had penetrated her brain. The small black dog, the only silent witness whose barking had caused the tenant to investigate, was locked inside a cupboard. An ambulance rushed her to the National Temperance Hospital on Hampstead Road. Barely alive and with her chance of surviving thought to be 1 in a million, she was rushed straight into surgery to be operated upon by the eminent surgeon, Dr. Guy Rigby-Jones, where, despite his best efforts, Edith Humphreys, too badly injured, died on the operating table. Chief Inspector Peter Beveridge and Divisional Detective Inspector Leonard Clare arrived from Scotland Yard to head the investigation. They found the front door unlocked and no sign of forced entry. Jill Steele said that on the previous evening she had been visited in her room by some friends and had not seen or heard anything unusual when they left at 11 o'clock. Beveridge found the woman's room to be neat and tidy, and while the killer had managed to steal a number of items, including a gold ring and some costume jewellery, there was money in the handbag, and saving certificates for a substantial amount of money in a drawer had not been touched. None of the neighbours had seen a man enter the house nor heard any sound. With the untouched money and the terrier locked in the cupboard, it seemed likely the attacker, who she had presumably invited into the house, had been disturbed by the dog's barking and had been forced to flee. The police thought the murderer had come in and left by the street door, taking with him the sharp-pointed weapon which had been used to kill Mrs. Humphreys, and although she had not been sexually assaulted, he had used extreme and unnecessary violence. Mrs. Humphreys had been working as a cook at the Islington Auxiliary Fire Station, as well as bookkeeping for the firemen, and Beveridge thought they had an important clue when they discovered 2 letters addressed to the dead woman in her bedside drawer. Written by the wife of a fireman, the first letter accused Mrs. Humphreys of carrying on with her husband. Police learned that Mrs. Humphreys had become enraged and kicked up a fuss with the Islington station officer. As a result, a second letter followed a day or two later, in which the fireman's wife apologised that she had been foolish enough to take notice of fire station gossip, admitted it was all a misunderstanding, and there was no truth in the allegations that she had made against Mrs. Humphreys, and begged her for forgiveness. Detectives learned from friends she was pleasant and well-liked, and her only real issue was an on-off boyfriend who was described as being quite persistent. He was traced and his alibi was unbreakable. Investigations were also carried out into the movements of 20 men known to be on friendly terms with the victim, described as a well-to-do, cheerful, respectable widow of a taxi driver. Most were cabbies and friends of her late husband. One by one they were questioned and able to show they too had alibis. As with the other investigations Scotland Yard were dealing with, wartime conditions hampered the investigation, stretching the team of murder squad detectives to the limit. Although the search for the 3 Blackout killers continued in London, the hunt for the monocle-wearing swindler-cum-murderer took detectives out of the capital and heading north. Chief Inspector Salisbury then discovered that on Thursday the 9th of October, just 9 days before the murder of Mrs. Greenhill, Harold Dorian Trevor had responded to an advertisement for a tenancy in Sloane Street and agreed to rent the flat. He had then stolen some property and disappeared. Piecing together what had happened on the following Tuesday, detectives learned Mrs. Greenhill had been visited by a tall, slim, elderly gentleman wearing a monocle and with thinning grey hair had been seen entering the house. He had clearly expressed an interest in renting the flat, and as he had been killed in the process of writing a receipt, he must have agreed to take it there and then. The few pounds she had requested as a down payment would have then been produced, and he would have then proceeded to batter her unconscious and then strangle her. He had then filled a trunk with items of value he found in the house before heading onto the street and asking a passerby to help him hail a taxi. The man had then heard him tell the driver he wanted to go to King's Cross Station. The taxi driver was traced and said that Trevor had talked nervously as he was being driven from the scene. The hunt for Errol Dorian Trevor took police to Birmingham, where some of the missing items turned up in a pawn shop. There he had pawned 2 of her rings and sold the trunk and other articles which were found to have been taken from Mrs. Greenhill's and the house on Sloane Street. The trail then led detectives to Sutton Coalfield and on to North Wales. War Reserve Constable David Thomas had left his job in a Colwyn Bay drapery business at the end of September to join the local police, and though he had had some rudimentary training, he had not as yet been issued with a uniform. Briefed to be on the lookout for the wanted Dr. Trevor, who was believed to be heading towards Rhyl, PC Thomas was patrolling the streets of the seaside resort on Saturday morning, the 18th of October, when he spotted a tall man matching his description exit the railway station cafe and make towards the telephone box. He waited until he finished the call, and as he stepped out, PC Thomas challenged him. "I believe your name is Trevor," he said, asking him to accompany him to the police station. After admitting that he was the wanted man, Trevor was placed in a cell and a call put through to Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector Salisbury hurried north and at 10 o'clock that night cautioned Trevor he was being taken back to Notting Hill Police Station to be charged with the murder of Mrs. Greenhill. "It wasn't murder," Trevor protested. "There was never any intent to murder. I have never used violence to anyone in my life before. What came over me I do not know. After I hit her, my mind went blank, and it's still like that now. Something seemed to crack in my head." Trevor was returned to London by train, where he appeared at a remand hearing held at the West London Police Court on Tuesday the 28th of October. He was described as an architect of Prospect Terrace, Fulford, York, and Derek Curtis Bennett, acting in his defence, referred to a confession allegedly made by Trevor to Chief Inspector Salisbury on the train journey south from Rhyl. Salisbury said that Trevor was handcuffed at all times and there was another detective officer with him in the carriage. During the arduous 7-hour journey, Trevor had 2 bottles of beer and several cups of tea. Curtis Bennett said he was suggesting that the statement made by Trevor confessing to the murder was not a voluntary one, but that he was induced to make it after a long and tiring journey during which he consumed a considerable quantity of beer. Mr. Vincent Evans for the prosecution countered this by saying it was not true that 16 bottles of beer had been shared between the 3 of them. He said that only 6 bottles of beer had been purchased, shared equally, and there was no suggestion Trevor's statement was coerced out of him after detectives had plied him with drink. Errol Dorian Trevor stood trial at the Old Bailey on Wednesday the 28th of January before Mr. Justice Asquith. Lawrence Byrne KC appeared for the Crown, with John Flowers and Derek Curtis Bennett KC for the defence. The defence from the outset claimed that Trevor was guilty but insane, and the trial became a debate as to whether he should be convicted of murder and sent to the gallows or found insane and removed to Broadmoor. In the dock, Trevor claimed he had no memory of the attack, but he did remember calling for a taxi, and Dr. Grierson, the medical officer at Brixton, who had observed Trevor since his arrest, said he could find no evidence of any form of insanity in the accused. After 2 days of legal and medical argument, it was left for the jury to decide his fate. They returned to find Trevor guilty as charged, and made no recommendation to mercy. Asked if he had anything to say before Mr. Justice Asquith passed sentence of death, Errol Trevor looked around the court and then spoke in a firm and steady voice. "I would like to say once and for all that I, as a man who stands, so to speak, at death's door, would like to confirm all I've already said regarding this lady's death, that I have no knowledge of it. Even as I am speaking, the moving figure is writing on the wall, and the words once written can never be recalled. I sincerely hope that each of you gentlemen of the jury, and the judge too, in passing sentence will remember these words, that when each of you, as you surely must, some day yourself, stand before a higher tribunal, you will receive a greater measure of mercy than has been meted out to me in this world. If I am called upon to take stand in the cold grey dawn of the early morning, I pray that my God, in his mercy, will gently turn my mother's face away as I pass into the shadows. No fear touches my heart. My heart is dead. It died when my mother left me. After sentence was passed, Trevor made one last remark from the dock, thanking my legal adviser and a very true friend in my time of trouble, adding finally, incongruous as it may seem to you, my sympathy is with the bereaved daughters of that poor woman, and if my life can be any satisfaction to them, then take it. Taken to Wandsworth Jail, a place he knew well from his previous incarcerations, this time it was to the condemned cell. Trevor was noted as being disturbed and unsettled as he awaited the result of his appeal. He penned a long letter in support of it, declaring, I have lived my life not as I would have liked to have lived it, but as it was forced upon me by fate. I was educated at a first-class school in Birmingham and was friend and playmate of men who are bishops today. Some of them are sitting in episcopal chairs while I am awaiting the short walk from the condemned cell to the scaffold. Heard before Mr Justice Cassels, Humphreys and Singleton on the 23rd of February 1942, Trevor's appeal was quickly dismissed, but the judges did order a further medical inquiry should take place. It merely concurred with the original findings, and at 9 o'clock on Wednesday the 11th of March 1942, Harold Dorian Trevor was hanged at Wandsworth by Albert Pierrepoint and assistant Herbert Morris. The murder of Mrs Greenhill was so unnecessary and out of character, his counsel actually believed that, after a life in and out of court on lesser charges, he had now, in his old age, sought the final satisfaction of being tried on a capital charge and thus ending his life on the gallows and not in a prison cell. There was one final irony of Trevor's pursuit for easy money without the need to work for it. On the night following the murder of Mrs Greenhill, he slept in a Birmingham hotel room which the proprietress, fearful of the house being bombed and looted, had hidden several £1,000s in crisp new banknotes inside his mattress. On his last night as a free man, Harold Dorian Trevor had slept beside what he had spent all his life trying to unlawfully acquire. Then, in early February 1942, as Harold Dorian Trevor's last days on earth were being counted down, Scotland Yard detectives were faced with another series of murders in the Blackout.